Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our weekly webinar. Now, just to remind you, I've been kind of switching off on topics for my part on two topics. One is where to put a practice, literally, what parts of the country are showing the greatest amount of promise. And not just parts of the country, but segments of various states. But we're also talking about demographic characteristics that you ought to track. Now, the whole vibe that we've got going on here, Mike and I, is that we're trying to teach you how to evaluate the numbers. Nobody else has ever done that. You certainly didn't go to medical or dental school or optometric program or veterinary to learn demographics. So we're trying to teach you a little bit about what to look for. Today is no exception. And I'm going to talk to you about one of those rather stupid and silly factors that no one ever talks about. Sure, they'll talk about growth, they'll talk about income. There's always a lot of discussion about what's a reasonable competition ratio. But almost no one talks about the population per household. And the reason that that is the case is it is not a threshold number. It doesn't mean that if you have a certain threshold of this statistic, oh, that's great, this is what we want to have. Because the fact is, there are different ways to look at the population per household. They're neither good nor bad, they just are, and your practice is going to depend upon your ability to know what those numbers actually mean. And we're going to talk about the meaning of those numbers in our next little section here. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And Mike is probably amazed that I'm able to do this so much more readily than I used to.
Very fluidly, yes. Beautiful.
I'm being mocked. I'm being mocked. Somebody make him stop. Okay, well, maybe not. Now, here's the thing I want you to understand. The population per household numbers are given out by almost every demographic vendor. Unfortunately, they haven't got a clue as to what they mean. There's no way to evaluate it. But it's a number that's easily thrown out. Today, I want to actually tell you how to look at it. And as soon as my slideshow kind of comes up, it'll all make it nice.
Man, we were feeling so good about the way that you did it too.
Well, it's my computer's fault, Mike, not mine.
Is it? Always the computer's fault.
Yeah. Mike, you can be replaced by another computer. Just to let you know, there's got to be an algorithm or program out there that can.
There we go.
Sidekick 3.0.
Right.
All right, hang on. Now, as I said, no threshold factor is necessary, only the understanding of the nature of what it is. Now, I'm going to go through my my little slides here, but I don't want to waste a lot of time. So here's what I'm going to talk about. Let's define what a household is. Now, there are all kinds of demographic theories on this or that or statistical analysis. I'm actually going to just tell you the truth. It's not that hard, particularly if you use the M. Scott McDonald School of doing it. Here's the thing. A household, by its definition, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, is this. It's a front door. No matter how many doors there are on a house, only one front door exists. So you could say, all right, I just want to count the number of front doors. If there's a back door, side door, basement door, cellar, attic, whatever, it doesn't matter. No matter how many people live behind that front door, the front door is the threshold demographic fact. Okay. A couple of weeks ago, I had the same thing, but I'm just going to ask you to just kind of swing with me here as we go through this whole thing. Now, defining that front door isn't hard. You all know intuitively what it means. With a front door, no matter what the relationship of all the people living behind that front door might be, no matter how much money they have, no matter what type of building it is, it doesn't matter. An apartment has a front door, a condominium, a single family dwelling, a trailer. All of them have that one statistic in mind. So when the guy comes by with his clipboard to measure, all right, what have we got? They're going to say a household is the front door. And there are people living indoors, inside of it. Now, a little fact, by the way, every household is essentially occupied based on the Census Bureau. If it is not occupied, they don't count it. They're not counting buildings when they're doing the census, they're counting people and how many people live per household. So, whether they're a family or not, it's another issue. Now, keep this in mind. Let's talk about a family. There is a statistical relationship between what a family is and just individuals. Family people usually have to be combined through a legal process, either adoption, marriage, legal cohabitation. They live together because they've all pretty much agreed to be there and they call themselves a family. You can count yourself on your taxes as being a household, head of household, or a member of a household, and all of them have that implication of a family, but don't get carried away that everybody in a household has to be related. They do not. If we look at different ways of characterizing a household, there are some that are single people, there are married, there are multiple people. The number of people per household, however, is what we're talking about today, and it's extremely important. It's important because it implies a lot about the viability of a practice area. Now, some people have the idea that, oh, I just need to know how many people there are within an area to decide whether or not there are sufficient people to support the kind of practice that I'm running. Hold on, cowboy. If the minimum number of people per household is 1, the difference between 1 and 2 is very great statistically. If we go back to the idea of, all right, well, why don't people just live alone? Let's talk about that. Why do people tend to live in households with other people? First of all, when you go back into psychological and sociological theory, it's a fact that people find it better to live with other people, regardless of how many bathrooms you've got in your house and how people share them. If we're talking about the reality is a single person in a household is taking all the utilities and all the expenses upon themselves. The smallest household tends to be defined as a studio apartment. That usually has a bathroom, a bedroom, and other things like a kitchenette or some kind of a fact like that. But you might notice that the size of a house or a household is static when it comes to the size of it. Let me explain. A single person living in a studio apartment is going to pay the same thing as 2 people sharing that same space. And what most people realize, it is far less expensive to have more than one person sharing that space. So you divide the amount of overhead, the rent and utilities, by the number of people who live there. It doesn't mean that everybody's working, but it just means that's how that's usually calculated. It's much more efficient to have that. Now, you'll notice, by the way, that as you add more people to the household, the size of the house changes. In other words, they need more floor space, but the relationship they have and how they live and what they spend also changes. If you've got 2 people who have a job, that household is going to double in terms of how much it's got. So 2 people sharing a house, if both are working, they can afford a lot more stuff, like more beds, more food, more entertainment, more things. So people find it a better idea to have more than one person per household. As soon as you add a child to that household, or you get a third adult, and by the way, let's just be honest, when you add more people to a household, they're going to tend to be in a relationship. Often they're going to be married, cohabitating singles, but not necessarily. So you do have people who are in roommate situations. When we go back to that very small studio apartment, a place that multiple people could live, but it's generally designed for one person, they fall within 2 categories, and that is the very young and the very old. The very young are more often going to be college students or young single people who are working. Now, they're going to be poor. That's the age in which people don't have a lot of money and they're living in a small place. If they get to be older, they will often have single people who are living in an assisted living environment or with a spouse. That situation is very different. in terms of the numbers of people there, but oddly, the very young and the very old living in a household share a great deal in common. So, what is the US Census tracking? They're going to be looking primarily at how many people other than the two people who make up a household represent. So, they're often going to have a third adult, or they're going to have children. And children tends to be the most common thing. Now, it's not as though a single parent and a child won't make up a household. They will, and they're, believe it or not, in a family relation. But if you only have one earner, one head of household, that tends to change the way that people live. Now, you may say, well, I'm a doctor. What do I care? The more people you have per household, the more patients you have per area. Ultimately, the very young are not going to need much in terms of their clinical care. The very old, on the other hand, need a great deal. And they often will pay a significant amount of their income toward their health care. So your doctors, most of you, when you're considering where should I put my practice, you're looking at the number of households and also at the age of the residents. There is a significant correlation between the age of the people who live per household and the number of people who live in that household, and I'll talk about that in a minute. As soon as you have usually two people who have children who are related to them, in other words, a family, they will make a major change in how much money they have coming in. Now, you may say, wait a second, they may not be rich, they may be very poor. And that is true. But the tendency is when you have two adults who are in the same household, each is going to have some source of income or revenue, may not be working, but they have other assets that they're bringing in, often through public assistance. The reason that that's important is a household that has more members is more desirable in most cases to a healthcare practice. Therefore, the larger household, meaning a household with more people in it, will tend to be more desirable for doctors to consider. Now think about this. You're there in an office and you're trying to attract as many people into your practice as you possibly can. If you only have, well, one household, but several people living within that, it is far more cost effective for you to advertise or to promote your practice to those people. If you're trying to be cost effective about your use of your dollars to promote your practice, in every single case, more people represents more potential patients, and more potential patients represents, regardless of income, more revenue to you. Therefore, when you're trying to figure out where should I put my practice, you typically want to find places that have the largest population per household as possible. Now, I'm going to get specific and to tell you how it usually breaks down. But just remember, the more people that you have that you're approaching or that you have near your office, the better off you are. Therefore, and I hope I haven't lost you in this demographic morass, the more people per population you have and the more people per household, the better the practice will tend to do. Now, let's talk about the difference between apartments and single-family dwellings. An apartment is usually going to have a smaller population per household. There's just not as much space. A single-family dwelling will often have more rooms and therefore more people living per household. I'll get specific in just a second, but I want you to understand that's the principle of how demographers look at the household and the population per household. Now, let me just tell you the differences between them and the implications of what it's going to mean for your practice. Does it mean doctors do not want to go to an area that has single-person households? Not at all. However, it will generally be true that when you have more people there, it's going to make more cost efficiency in your promoting of your practice with more people per household. Oddly enough, when a person gets married, let's say a man marries a woman, his significant other is going to say, you know, sweetheart, you need to go to the doctor because I don't want you to die and leave me alone. That's pretty self-serving, I suppose, but it's still true. It is also true that a man and a woman who cohabitate are many times more likely to have children or other people who will join their household. And therefore, the tendency is when there are people who are in a relationship together, they will tend to spend far more on their medical expenses, whether it's glasses or anything, including a pet. People who have pets obviously are going to spend much more on veterinary medicine. The larger their dwelling, meaning, in other words, a single family dwelling, let's say, is going to have a lot more pets than an apartment. And therefore, the potential for production is far greater as the size of the house, the living space, goes up. The more people that are there, the more likelihood there is that they're going to have a pet or more pets. If you add children to it, regardless of age, there's also a greater tendency for people to spend on more stuff. They call this the barbecue test. Now, one of the great aspirations in American society, and I've mentioned this before, is to have a barbecue. If you have a backyard, you're going to have more stuff, more places to store your stuff than if you're in a little condominium or a studio apartment. You don't have a barbecue. And therefore, demographers have come up with this little rule of thumb. Where are the barbecues? Where are the large single family dwellings? Where are the households that have lots of people in them? That's what doctors should be seeking for, to find the most cost-efficient place for them to practice. Now, you may say older people are going to generally spend more on healthcare, and that is absolutely true. For one thing, younger people don't have the clinical needs. Older people have more. Younger people don't have as much money to spend on their clinical needs. Well, older people have more. But knowing that there's a demographic difference and a desirability for your finding the right place to practice matters a lot. Now, I hope I haven't lost you, but and I'm not trying to say there are good and bad situations. I'm going to tell you just some tendencies. In fact, I want to just explain something to you about the United States. Some people say, well, what state should I move for? Look, as far as dwellings and single family dwellings and household size and population per household, doesn't matter. Because every state and every city is going to have a pocket that will be more inclined to have single or married or children or not. You're just trying to find the neighborhood within the area that you're practicing and let that be the deciding factor on where you go. Yes, I do have preferences for certain places in the United States, and a lot of the work that we do at drdemographics.com is to help you figure out where to go for the kind of clinical services you want to offer and the kinds of people you want to reach. I got that. But I just want you to know that there are some truisms that I think you have to understand about how people live, and as it affects the population per household. Now remember, this is a moving target. What just 10 years ago may have been a great place for the population per household is going to change. One of the reasons that it changes is if you have a neighborhood with lots of kids, those kids are going to get old and they're going to leave and form their own households. It's possible that older adults may lose a spouse and therefore fewer people will be in that household. Many times the dwellings are going to change ownership because the conditions of the residents are going to change. So what I'm really telling you is it's a moving target. I can tell you within any given community where the better population per household might be, but I'm going to tell you, don't get too carried away with the idea that it won't change. Because every 15 years or so, it will have to, the assumptions of who lives where is going to change a lot. Now, there are some correlations that I want you to understand. There are three of them. The first one is age and population per household. I mentioned to you at the beginning that there are single family households. You know, they're one person per household. They're going to be either young or they're going to be old. But the age of the number of people in the household is going to strongly affect the nature of the household. So a new baby is born in a household. It is going to be much different than a household that has no babies. When you have 2 or 3 little kids in a household, it's going to be very different than if you have a household with 3 or 4 teenagers. What they're going to need and what they're going to want and where they're going to live will vary. So you can't just take the number of people per household. You got to figure out how old are the people in the household and consider that as a model, if you will. There isn't a good age or a bad age, there's just an age. There isn't the fact that college students are going to be terrible, they're not, or older adults are going to be awful, they're not, but they're different. And knowing how they're changing matters. Now, if you're in an area that has a college town, I mean, a university is a dominant employer, for example, it's going to matter how old people are, but it's also going to be true that they'll tend to replace themselves with people of that younger age group. So 18 to 20-year-olds are not going to stay there forever, but there will always be 18 to 20-year-olds living near the college. That's a truism, and the same thing is going to be true of retirement communities. So you have to take into account age and the population per household because there's a correlation as to what the desirability of that model will be to you. Guys, I know this is complicated, but I think you're doctors. You should understand this stuff. Now, let's talk about the next correlation, and that's income with the population per household. Yeah, the fewer people who live in a household, the poorer they are going to tend to be. The more people you put into that household, and of course, the correlation with the size of the house, which I'll talk about in a second, it matters. But the income and the population per household has to be measured together and not separately. So when somebody says, all right, what's the population per household? Is it good? Is it bad? We say, okay, well, tell me the next factor, income. Affluent households of exactly the same population size are going to act and consume very different than people who don't have that much money. Now let's talk about housing type for a second. Yes, I mentioned at the beginning, apartments, condominiums, trailers, but also single family dwellings, and they come in all different sizes. Couple of facts though. Single family dwellings, apartments, whatever, are going to tend to be very similar in income and age to their neighbors. So you'll typically find a place that has a certain kind of household, population per household size, and it will be very much like their neighbors. Once they get older kids, they'll come or go depending on what the neighborhood's like. A population that lives in single family dwellings will have a few things in common that are very helpful. There is an income statistic that helps. By the way, you know that people who live in a home that they own are generally going to have better credit. They're going to have more people living there, more pets, and they're going to spend on their health care to a greater degree. However, if the type of housing is very small, kind of dilapidated, doesn't have a very high value, or it isn't increasing in value, it's going to change the desirability of that area from your perspective, from the doctor's perspective. Therefore, we have to look at the housing type and how much the household is worth, or house is worth. Whenever we're doing a practice site viability study, we will always give to you not only the median household income, but we're also going to share with you the value of the house. The median value of the home may be going up and it may be going down, but the relationship by how much people have as far as their income and how much the house is worth are important correlations. If a house is worth a lot and its value is increasing, well, that's going to say something important about the residents and their ability and desirability to pay for their clinical care. You get it? So those are the correlations that you have to count: the age, income, and housing type. And of course, the housing type implies the amount that the house is worth, its general value, and the credit worthiness, and the ability to accumulate wealth within that area. Now, you may say, I don't know, I can't remember all this. That's okay. That's what we're here for. See, not only are we going to help you reason it out, we're going to give you the numbers and say why it's important. Most demographic companies will state the facts because they don't understand the relationship of these numbers to each other. We do. And that's why it's an important topic for us to discuss when we're doing a practice site viability study. Now, practices usually target by this statistic, the population per household, and they don't even know they're doing it. But the fact is, not all practices do as well with populations of different sizes. Sometimes they do well with people who are uh, living alone, and sometimes older and younger living alone, or have a large family, or no children present at all. And it's funny, if you look at your own patient base and do some statistics, you may find you already have a group of people that you're already offering services to that are different from other people. That is what they refer to literally as target marketing. And that's how we find a target for you to focus upon. That's where Mike is so helpful in teaching people about marketing statistics and how to utilize them so that you'll know this is the area that's going to work for me, how much to charge, what services to offer, and how to promote our services. Now, I've got on this page a series of numbers. There are 6, and I'm going to tell you real quick what they mean. 1.99. Generally speaking, when there is a population that has a very low population per household, they come in a little under 1.99. That's a general rule of thumb. When you go to 2.2 persons per household, it's going to indicate most often these are older people. Now, it's odd, but dorms don't usually go up to 2.2. They'll either go much more or far fewer. But 2.2 is, generally speaking, where the older population will lie. So if you see a population per household of 2.2, I can almost guarantee you they're going to be older people. 2.5 is the median in the United States. In some states, it goes to 2.4. Some go up to 2.6. But that is an average single-family dwelling population number. The population per household in that category, you can usually assume that they're going to have reasonably strong credit, 2 working adults, and that's a desirable statistic. If you go to 2.9, that is the extreme on a single family middle class household. Normally, it does not go much above that, but I'm talking about the median within any given population, 2.9. When you see 3.5 population per household, there are a couple of things I want you to keep in mind. You have to ask, first of all, are they a multi-generational area? In other words, do grandma and grandpa and the grandkids live in the house with the parents? That's where you find that number of 3.5 is much more common. So if you go to San Jose, many Asians, multi-generational, living in a pretty expensive property, that's what the statistics are going to tend to be. Now, let's say you go to Idaho or maybe Utah or Arizona. The numbers can very often be over 4. Now, that happens whenever you have typically a religious nuclear family that happens to have more children than the average. It doesn't mean it's good, and it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that's what you're often finding when that statistic comes up. Do you find a lot of 4+ population per household in New York State or Chicago or San Francisco? The answer is no, you do not. Oh, it happens occasionally, but they're usually statistically a minority. And that's the thing I want you to keep in mind. It's the minority. Now, if you're kind of wondering and evaluating, where should I go? What is a place, good or bad? The practice site viability tracks the population per household very carefully. Not only are we going to give you the statistic, but we're going to tell you what the statistic means. And if there's anything that makes Dr. Demographics different from everything else, it's the meaning of what the numbers are. So don't just assume that some vendor is going to be able to put out a database, which they usually purchase from a realtor or a real estate database, that's going to tell you anything important. It won't. That's why you need this kind of analysis. If you want to find the perfect place to put a practice, call us and we can help you do the evaluation. Now, Mike, do you have any other thoughts?
You know, just one, although you covered the topic extremely well and very thorough.
Thank you, Mike.
So, great job, Scott. I think the biggest thing that I pull out of it from a marketing perspective is that sometimes we have doctors that that the target does change over time. Their neighborhoods will change, and sometimes quite rapidly. In areas like Austin and Houston and some of those areas that are growing so quickly, their neighborhoods can change overnight. You can go from a certain type of household to a different one very quickly. I had a doctor that had a huge a developer that came in and built a whole bunch of apartments in a traditionally single family type neighborhood, and it completely changed the makeup of his patients. And so my point is, and I really like what you said, it's not good or bad. It's not that this type of household is good and this type of household is bad. Again, like I always say, as marketers, we're agnostic to that. We are, okay, what does the neighborhood look like now? What is the strategy that we need to deploy that's going to match it in a direct way the population that's surrounding the practice? That's really what you need to be thinking of, especially if you're already practicing. If you've already invested into a building, you already have a name in a community. That's where you really need to focus. So again, if you need help identifying that or interpreting the data that you're getting, feel free to give us a call, 800-424-6222. Either Scott or I will be happy to answer your questions.
Or write to us at info@drdemographics.com, which is pretty darn good too.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're running out of time. Mike, thank you so much for your wisdom. I do want to say one thing to our practice brokers, and I'm going to send this to practice brokers in the United States. I want them to understand that increasingly the value or the viability of a practice from their perspective is going to change as the household population changes, and it's a moving target. So anyway, just want to let you know that. We'll send that out too. All right, take care. And again, thanks again, Mike. We appreciate it. Take care.